Awareness, the final frontier. These are the explorations of Jonathan Robinson and Brian Tom O'Connor. Their continuing mission, to discover fresh new paths to the mystery within, to seek out new joys and new methods of awakening, to boldly go into the heart of expanded consciousness. This is Awareness Explorers.
Well, welcome, Awareness Explorers family and friends. Good to have you back. We have an important topic today, which is what the hell is enlightenment? And I'm here with my co-host,
Brian Tom O'Connor.
There he is. And I'm Jonathan Robinson. If this is your first time, welcome. What we have is a discussion about important topics relating to awakening. And then we talk about specific methods to help you to get to that place of awakening, whatever that means. And that's part of what we're going to explore today. You know, Brian, I find that people used to use the term enlightenment a lot. And a little bit, it's going out of fashion now. It's now more about awakening. And I think that that's interesting. Part of the problem was that enlightenment was such a vague concept, and one that seems so counter to what people's actual experience was for themselves and gurus. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
It's true that awakening is now the more popular phrase. And it's true that enlightenment was looked upon as something that you didn't want to talk about because anyone who would claim they were enlightened surely wasn't enlightened. Also,
Exactly.
It was difficult to define what enlightenment is. But to tell you the truth, I think awakening is just as nebulous and ill-defined as enlightenment. It's just the term du jour.
Yeah, but luckily we're awareness explorers, so we get to look at all these terms and see what's there and what's not. And when I think of either the term awakening or enlightenment, I see a progression. People used to think of them as, you know, the bolt of lightning hit you or some guru and they became fully enlightened and never had a problem again and were always good and pure. We now know that that's a crock of crap. So most of us know that. And so we're having to look at these terms again. What does it really refer to when we say somebody's awakened or somebody's enlightened? And I'm thinking that, you know how the Eskimo supposedly have 50 names for snow because snow is very important to them. They have a lot of distinctions. To me, you know, there's snow and there's hail, but to them, there's a lot more to it. And I think the same is applying to awakening and enlightenment. We just haven't had any distinction, so it was all or nothing. Mm-hmm. But now we're having to realize, well, there's different types of awakenings. There's different levels of enlightenment or different experiences of enlightenment. Yet we haven't come up with new words to describe all these different things that people tune into. So that's kind of what I've seen as an overview. And I'm wondering if you have similar ideas or do you see it differently?
Well, it all depends on who you talk to and who you're reading about what the terms mean and which terms to use. And it's true, we have awakening, we have enlightenment, we have expanded consciousness. We could probably make a long list, including God and including...
God realized?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Krishna consciousness, God consciousness.
And if you go all the way back to the 70s, cosmic consciousness.
Cosmic consciousness. Yes, I remember that book. That was very influential.
So what we don't have is any sense of what any of these terms actually are referring to. People like to make big claims or throw out terms. So let's get into a little bit of the nitty gritty of, first of all, one question I have is enlightenment, awakening something that happens gradually, or does it happen all at once?
That's a good question. There are people who say it's instantaneous. it's binary. There's before enlightenment and there's after enlightenment, or before awakening and after awakening. And then there are people who say, no, you can gradually work towards enlightenment or awakening. But I think that the question actually conceals a hidden problem in that what we're talking about is an event that's going to happen to me, the person, the ego, the individual, at some time in the future, and has not happened now. And that's the problem with what's happening now, is that I am not enlightened or I am not awake yet. And that's just conceptually a baked-in problem to the whole idea of enlightenment or awakening.
Yeah, and so if enlightenment is something that happens to some people in the future, it's not seen as a verb. A verb is something that is happening now, like running. You don't say running will happen in the future. You're either running or you're not. And I tend to define enlightenment as an experience that people have of pure awareness. Then the question becomes, do they continue with that experience, or is it something that happened one time? Is it something that happens a few moments a day? And that when people have that experience, it doesn't change everything. It just changes your perspective of right now in a very unique way. But there's still plenty of work to be done to, as Ken Wilber would say, to grow up. You know, waking up to pure awareness is an experience, but then how do you grow up so that you're living a different way than you were before you were, quote, awake?
That's right. And you can have that experience of knowing yourself as pure awareness many, many times throughout the day, for short periods at a time or for longer periods at a time. And you can have them during times that are relatively easy, and you can practice so that you can actually know yourself as awareness during times that are more difficult or stressful. And what happens, I think, is that it's like drops of oil in a hot pan. You have one drop, and then you have another drop, and then you have another drop, and they're kind of separate. And you just keep dropping them, and eventually one drop touches the other, and it becomes a bigger drop. And that drop touches the third, and it becomes a bigger drop. And then eventually, the entire pan is filled with just one drop, just as your entire life is filled with continual moments of seeing yourself and the world from the position of the pure background awareness.
Well, I'll meet your metaphor and try to up you one. That's a nice metaphor, by the way. I like it. Here's the metaphor that I tend to look at. I see, let's call our sense of self as a big wall. And we have this wall that separates us from other people. And then we have an awakening experience, which is kind of like a hole in that wall that lets the light through. Mm-hmm. And then you get another experience for a moment here, a moment there, maybe through meditation or drugs or luck. And soon there's all kinds of holes in that wall with lots of light coming through. And eventually the wall just crumbles because there's not enough of your separate sense of self holding it up anymore. And when there's no wall between you and other people and you and the world, you could say you are, quote, fully enlightened, because there is no longer a separate sense of self that you either take seriously or that you even can believe in any way. And I know for myself, I can really feel like the wall is getting more and more holes in it. So I have a hard time sometimes identifying quite so much as Jonathan, because I don't feel like Jonathan that much anymore. I feel more like I'm just this presence here, and people are projecting all kinds of Jonathan on me, but I don't feel like him so much anymore. But sometimes I do. And it kind of comes and goes. And I'm wondering if that's similar for you.
Yes, that is similar to me. And I also define enlightenment as the dissolution of the sense of a separate self. And
Great minds think alike, evidently. But of course, we are not identified with our mind, so we can't even say it's our mind.
no, well, we have a finite mind, but that's not really who we are.
Yeah, yeah.
But of course, that definition is very useful, and that definition is certainly not original. It's from people that I've read about who claim to have gone to the other side or to have lost the identification or the sense of a separate self. And I think that's very interesting, but I still feel like a separate self most of the time. But there are times when I realize that what I call a separate self is my body and my mind, and that there is something that knows my body, and there's something that knows my mind that isn't the body and mind. And whenever I am in touch with that, which I call pure awareness, then the body and mind becomes flooded with a sense of happiness and joy, as if it's touching this more universal consciousness. Because usually it's a one-way stream. We're thinking, we're thinking, we're thinking, we're problem solving, we're fixing, and everything from our finite mind is flowing one way back to awareness. And awareness is noticing it all. And then when we can quiet down that thinking, fixing, then we actually touch that universal awareness, which is already awake, already enlightened, already loving, already accepting of everything, and is therefore pure joy and happiness. And when we touch that, there's an echo of that that comes back and flows through the individual body and mind. And that happens now, in this moment, not in some future point of enlightenment.
Yeah, it's either you're in touch with that now or you're not. And
Right.
if you're not, then it's always available. So why not give it a shot?
Yes, why not give it a shot? It's always available. And so I've always thought, well, hey, if this is available and this is where happiness lives, and I can tap into it at will, then let's tap into it. Let's not worry about some event in the future called enlightenment. Let's just be happy now.
Yeah. But, you know, there's something more than just being pure awareness, which Ken Wilber calls growing up, because you can kind of be a enlightened jerk in that the awareness is not in certain parts of your life, like relationships or something. So you're not, you have the quote, arrogance of saying in touch with God or awareness, but you don't have the maturity to take that higher loving vibration and use it to be effective in the world. And I think people confuse those two things. They think that anybody that's in touch with pure awareness is automatically saintly. But I think we have enough downfalls of gurus to know that that's not actually the case.
It's not actually the case. And you're right. There is a process, I believe, of applying the knowledge that the awareness that I am is identical to the awareness that you are and to the awareness that everyone else is. So in other words, what's looking out of my eyes is not only identical to what's looking out your eyes, but it may even be the exact same universal entity. And then the question is, how do I treat people with that knowledge? How do I engage with the world with that knowledge? Does it make me special and therefore superior or more saintly, as you put it, or more knowledgeable? Or does it give me more compassion and understanding for what people are going through and more willingness to be there for them, to connect with them on a human level? And I think that you're right. That's an ongoing growing up process.
As Ram Dass once told me, there's basically just one of us here in drag.
I love that.
So if there's only one of us and you're the hand and somebody else is the foot, you want to realize we're part of the same body, and you don't use your hand to slap your foot, you use your hand to help your foot.
Right. I think of it as the million-eyed mind. It's really one mind looking out through a million or billion or however many billions of sentient creatures there are in the trillions.
Yeah.
It's one mind looking at them all, like one security guard looking out at a whole bunch of security cameras stationed around, all on one big screen.
That's a good metaphor. You asked a really key question that I thought is worth exploring, and that is, how do I engage in the world with this knowledge, with this experience? And I'm going to do a guided meditation later that is focused on getting clear as to how we might engage the world differently from this more enlightened state of consciousness. But before I do that, I want to explore or tell you a story about meeting a enlightened master, somebody that some of our listeners probably know, named Punjaji. He died in the 90s, but he was a student of Ramana Maharshi. And I went to visit him in the early 90s, and he taught me an important lesson about how do you engage in the world from a more enlightened place. And when I walked into his ashram, he immediately pointed to me and told me to sit in front of him. Well, I was kind of like nervous. I didn't really know what the protocol here was. So I'm sitting in front of, this enlightened master, and he puts his eyes maybe a foot from mine, kind of looking at me closely. And then he finally says, "Who are you?" And I didn't know about Ramana Maharshi or that technique. So I said, "I'm Jonathan Robinson from the United States." And he and the 40 people in the room busted up laughing. They thought that was hysterical. So I thought to myself, that's the wrong answer. So then he had compassion and he said, "No, who are you really?" And I said, "I'm a spiritual seeker." And he kind of shook his head, no. Like, try again. And I said, "I'm a man." No, he shook his head again. An author. No, shake his head. I did this for about 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And people are kind of snickering. I didn't know what was going on. Finally, I shut up and I realized maybe I would just look in his eyes for a moment. And there was literally light coming out of his eyes. It was almost hard to look at him because there was so much light coming out of his eyes. And as I did that, I started to feel this energy in me. And everything started to get like expansive. And soon I was hit by what could best be described as a wall or a wave of love. And it was so strong that I immediately started crying, just breaking down crying. And I didn't know why I was crying, but I'd never felt so much love. And then I started laughing because I was both laughing and crying, and other people in the room were laughing and crying. And as I'm kind of like crying in his lap and practically drooling, he taps me on the head and he says, "This love that you feel is who you are." And he kept saying that, "This love that you feel is who you are, and your job is to bring it into the world." And I remember that as that's like his definition of enlightenment, taking that love that comes from a lack of separation, that comes from being connected to awareness, and bringing that into the world whatever way we can. So, many years ago, there was a bumper sticker that said, kind of like, what would Jesus do?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of changed the words of that to, what would an enlightened person do, or what would love do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's an interesting way to think about what enlightenment and awakening is it's an experience that we have if we're lucky. But then the question becomes, what does that look like in the many compartments of our life? And sometimes we might have one or two compartments where we've brought some love into it, but we probably have, I know I do, certain compartments that don't have a lot of light and love in them. They don't have a lot of awareness in them. And our job is to bring that light and love into those compartments that currently are unconscious or shadowy in some way.
Wow. I think that's great. I'm so glad to hear. I've always wanted to ask you about your experience with Papa G, which for our listeners who might not know is another fond expression that people call punja. And I so agree with that. The love that you're feeling now is who you are, and your job is to spread that to the world. I don't think it could be said better than that, because it really is about love. And enlightenment is something that we might think that we can get for the person, but we can't get it for the person. The person can't become enlightened. But the love that we are, which is universal, can know itself. And we can touch that, and we can then share it. We can interact with the world in a way that brings the love that's already there, that's already existing in all of experience. In fact, I think the entire universe is actually made of love. And when it doesn't feel like it, it's only because we've got veils in the way of it that need to be pulled aside.
Yeah, where either that wall of separation called the ego, or there's a lot of holes in that wall and there's light and love that is what's left. And your mission, should you decide to accept it, fellow awareness explorers, is to let some cracks in that wall, some light, what Leonard Cohen called, let some light through.
Yeah, what was it? There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. I think that's the quote.
Yeah, it's a beautiful quote.
Probably mistaken, but. Oh, and by the way, Catherine Ingram, another wonderful teacher who was with Papa G, wrote a novel called A Crack in Everything.
It's a small world.
Yeah.
There's one more topic I want to bring up before we do the guided meditation, and that is I took something called the Finder's Course, an excellent course led by a guy named Dr. Jeffrey Martin, who's a Harvard-trained neuroscientist. And he taught some great methods, some of the methods we discuss here. And he has a view of enlightenment that is that there's different levels of enlightenment or different types of enlightenment. There's just like there's different types of food. A banana, a cupcake, and a steak are all food, but they're very different. And he's distinguished the characteristics of these different types of, quote, awakening. And that can be very interesting. He has stuff online that you can find out where he describes them. And you can go back and forth between, say, level 1 and level 4 or level 3. And he says that different people are tuning into different things. They're all higher consciousness, but they are also different facets of this larger jewel. And I think that that's a very accurate way of describing things, because people do have very different perspectives or experiences on these paths, and there's no right or wrong. They're just different. And if you have a fluid consciousness, you actually can, sometimes eat steak, sometimes eat a banana, sometimes eat a cupcake, and experience the world from many different perspectives. So what do you think of that way of looking at the world?
Well, I think it's true that you can experience the world from many different perspectives. I think there's a danger in thinking about enlightenment in terms of levels, because then we sort of start to get caught up in concepts and we start to compare our experience to an idea of what level we're on. When really it's just so simple. Right now, right this moment, turn around and look inside to what's looking. And when you find that, you turn around and you look out from that place of pure awareness. And that place is already enlightened. It is already love. It's pure, unconditional love, because it totally allows and accepts everything that appears in it. And it's here right now, available for free anytime you want. And it never fails. It's always there. So why worry about all this enlightenment stuff, that thing that's going to happen to me someday? That's my devil's advocate rant for the day.
I like it. And very valid. And I agree that you can get too caught up in where you are, where you're going. And that is a very unenlightened approach to enlightenment.
On the other hand, all these people have tips that are really, really helpful. So I don't mean to put Jeffrey Martin down at all. He's got great techniques that are really totally helpful. The key is you try them and see what brings about that feeling of happiness for no reason for yourself.
Yeah, well said. Well, let's start with a guided meditation. It'll be probably 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes at most. And this one might be a little bit different. I'm going to have you contemplate certain questions. So if you possibly can, make yourself comfortable, close your eyes. If you're driving, of course, you can't do that. But if you can, make yourself comfortable, take a couple of slow, deep breaths. And the question that we've been contemplating is, what does enlightenment look like in life? And I want to ask that of you specifically, and ask it in relationship to certain parts of your life. So imagine you wake up the next morning, and whatever you might think enlightenment is or awakening is, it somehow magically happened to you during the night. Some people are just lucky that way. So you wake up and you're awakened. Well, what's different? What do you notice that you either have or don't have now that you're awakened? Notice if you feel different or if it's more of a different vantage point on what you're feeling. Notice if there's some thing that you feel is not there that used to be there, some obstacle that has been released. And now, as you imagine yourself doing your morning routine, maybe getting coffee or eating, how would you do it differently if you were suddenly enlightened or awakened? Would there be anything different? And as you imagine being at work, what might you do differently if you were more awakened or enlightened? Would you be kinder? Would you have more perspective? Would you have more peace? Would you treat yourself and your coworkers differently? Take some time and imagine and guess what would be different at work. If you suddenly woke up and you were more awakened or enlightened, how would you be different in your relationships? In your intimate relationship, if you have one, or with your kids or friends? Just imagine, what's your view of how you would be different in your relationships? And lastly, as you think about what would be different for you if you were awakened or more awakened, how would you relate to difficulty, difficult emotions, and difficult situations? What would be different as you had to deal with the stuff of life? Imagine what that would look like. And I have good news for you. You're already awakened. So all these things are possible. And your mission, should you decide to accept it, is to manifest this awakened consciousness that's already your nature into your daily life, your emotions, your work, and your relationships. So when you're ready, if your eyes were closed, slowly come back and live your awakening. How was that for you, Brian?
Oh, that was marvelous.
I think it helps to have these ideas, as long as you don't take them too seriously, because we don't really know how awakened consciousness responds to each moment. But we can guess, and to some extent, we do tune into this awakened consciousness, and we get to see how it responds differently than that wall of ego that we sometimes are.
Yes, and this exercise is a very good way to do that, imagining what it would be like. I know, for example, for me during it, I had a sense that there was no fight, there was no argument with what was going on. There were no problems to solve. Not that there might not be in life individual problems to overcome or tasks to solve, but that there was no objection to the fact that they were there, no resistance. Everything, it was just totally okay with what was going on right now, whatever that may be. And there was a sense that in relation with other people, that they were pretty much, they were okay the way they are, and I'm okay the way I am. And that that's okay, is really much, much bigger than I thought it was. It's huge, it's vast, it encompasses me and my mind and my body and other people's minds and other people's bodies and the whole world.
That's very poetic. That's a good note to start to wrap up on. My hope is that you'll use some of these ideas, that you can re-listen to that guided meditation, or just ask yourself that simple question: what would a awakened or enlightened person do in this moment? And you might be able to tune into it that quickly. our higher self or pure awareness is always there. So call upon it, and we'll check in with you and see how you did, and we'll try the same. And have fun with it, explore with it, tell your friends about it, share with them, and we'll be back here next time to go even further. So any last words you want to say, Brian?
No, I like the idea of just playing around and having fun. That sounds great. And when you said your mission, should you decide to accept it, I accept it.
Good. I hope our audience does too.
Me
so
too.
Till next time, keep exploring.
Keep exploring. Thank you for listening to Awareness Explorers. To learn more, you can check out our website at awarenessexplorers.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite podcast app. And we'd love it if you would post a review. And please share our link on Facebook and with family and friends, because knowing yourself as awareness is the greatest gift you can give yourself or someone you love.